Temple, welcome back to the podcast. It's always so fun and an honor to talk with you. I know we speak the same language in so many things, but if listeners don't know your whole story, we do have you featured way back in episode 54. So it's been a while, but I wanted to bring you back because this nutrition world that we live in as dietitians changes on the dime. Always things that are coming, into play, always new topics. Some things that I'm sure we, can agree on, some things that not you and I, but, just our followers. And it's always just great to get another perspective in. So welcome back to Fast to Heal Stories. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, I'm honored. I knew this was going to be fun. I love that we have such like minds on a lot of things. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and there aren't a ton of dietitians in the space that do think like we do. And we got to meet in January in person. So that was really fun. And maybe I'll have to come back out to Phoenix when it's cold here in Wisconsin and pay another visit.
Yeah, I would love it. I would love it. You're welcome anytime.
So those who aren't familiar with you, you're the ketogenic nutritionist on Instagram and pretty much across the board with all social media. Give us just a real brief overview, brief story as to how you got to that place, like how you got from the conventional dietetics, nutrition recommendations to more of the ketogenic nutritionist.
Yeah. I love this question because it's interesting that you can go from conventional to a little bit what I would call alternative nutrition. But essentially what happened was I was in college and I was really struggling with my cycle. I was having some severe hormonal dysregulation and I didn't know it, but I did know that nutrition really affected the way that I felt. And so that's what initially piqued my interest in getting into the field. And as a conventionally trained dietitian, you and I were probably both taught the same way of it's very your typical recommendations, lots of whole grains, limited saturated fat, pretty limited on protein, I would argue in a way as well. And so I was following these recommendations as a college student in school to become a dietitian, and I wasn't getting any better. In fact, I was getting progressively worse. I was having more symptoms. I was gaining more weight. My thyroid began to mess up as well. And it was just a hot mess, hormonal disaster is the way that I would describe it. And I was getting so frustrated because I was implementing everything that I had learned in school and everything that had been taught, and I was just getting worse and worse. And so that's really what made me decide to look to alternative therapies. And so I found Dr. Bickman's book, Why We Get Sick First, and then I read the obesity code. And at this time, I was a new dietitian. I was working in a hospital with veterans, and I was seeing a lot of the same conditions of type 2 diabetes. I was seeing all that type of metabolic disease. And so I started implementing these recommendations from Dr. Bickman's book and the obesity code. I started researching keto and low carb, and ultimately I reversed my PCOS, lost a ton of weight, regained my cycles, started feeling like a human again. And then I decided, you know what, if this worked for me, why can't it work for my type 2 diabetic veterans and clients? And so I started implementing it with them, and they were losing a ton of weight and getting off all this insulin and metformin and all these like crazy results that I was just not seeing with your typical dietetics recommendations. And I think that's really when the light turned on for me. And I thought, okay, there's a lot to this, and I think we're doing it wrong when it comes to conventional nutrition. And I've just never looked back. That was really the pivotal moment in my career. I ended up quitting my job at the VA and started a private practice. And yeah, the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, now you've blown up, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's
So,
fun.
yeah, so you mentioned taking people off of metformin, diabetes medications, insulin.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of people just have this notion that, especially once they've gotten to the point of needing insulin, like
Yeah.
it's just it for them. Like they're
Yeah.
going to be on insulin forever, and usually the units just continue to go up, and maybe several other diabetes medications. Like, what do you say to that? What are you seeing with your students and clients with coming off of these medications?
I see incredible results, and I see it is very shocking to me that a lot of people do not realize that you can put these conditions into remission in a lot of ways. And when I get people on a low carb ketogenic style, maybe even intermittent fasting, resistance training, when you change the diet and lifestyle, you're no longer having to increase insulin. You're no longer having to add these oral medications. And I've seen people get completely off of it. And so thankfully I worked with a very good endocrinologist and PCP, or regular physician, when I was at the hospital, that was very open-minded. And even they were like, I've been an endocrinologist for 20 years and I've never seen people have these types of results and get off these medications. And I feel like the results just speak for themselves. But I will say this and make a comment there. It is amazing to me that a lot of people do not realize that you're not stuck on this for life. You're not stuck on these medications for life. And I've even had people say, oh, you can't put type 2 diabetes in remission. That's not possible. Even well-educated doctors. And it's like, no, it absolutely is. Like, we're seeing it. People are doing it. When you get rid of the poison, essentially, of what you're doing to yourself in your diet, it's absolutely possible. And so there's a lot of hope in that. And at this point, we both have the testimonies to back it up. There's enough research to back it up, tons of it for that matter. And so, yeah, I think it gives people back control. And when they felt like they've been a slave to this disease for years and years and years, when that doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
Yeah, and it's really just crazy to think the whole mindset. And the conventionally trained physicians, you can't really blame them, because
No.
they're just there to diagnose
Yeah.
and to treat with medication and to, treat with insulin.
Yeah.
But it's really crazy how they're really not understanding the disease and the disease process and what's causing it in the first place. And like you said, there are many who are open and like, wow, if they have joined a program such as yours and seen reversal, and they might say, hey, what are you doing? But there are so many who just turned a complete blind eye to it and just say, no, this is something that you're going to have lifelong. So yeah, we definitely have so many testimonies of people who can reverse it. And people, like, I have a free masterclass that people watch about insulin resistance and how to test for it and how to start understanding the test results and how to start treating it. But they're blown away. They haven't heard of these test results, and they are blown away to know that they can actually reverse the disease process. So what steps, I know you said you had Hashimoto's and hypothyroid, and you also had PCOS. What are some of I'd like to focus a little bit more on PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, because we have had several thyroid experts on, but for PCOS, that is a very, very common endocrine disorder. It's the number one leading infertility, the cause of infertility in women. And I think just, going back to insulin resistance, you can talk more about the disease process, but there's kids, small children with insulin resistance. People are even arguing that babies are born with insulin resistance. They're just set up into this endocrine disorder from the time they're born, basically. But what specific steps did you take? We've talked about the actual disease on the podcast, but what specific steps? And of course, this is not going to be a blanket therapy for any one person, but there are some things that definitely help just about anybody. But what with this disease process and fertility issues and not getting a period, but what are some specific things that you did to get your cycles back?
Yeah, a great question. So first, I obviously learned as much as I could about how what it does and how it affects you. And then I started to realize, oh, wow, these are the foods that are causing blood sugar dysregulation. And also understanding that it's a little bit more extreme in women with PCOS in terms of blood sugar dysregulation, like what you would typically think wouldn't affect, someone without PCOS would affect me more. So that comes with complex carbs and beans and starches and things that we consider quote unquote low glycemic or moderate glycemic. I understood that, okay, I'm already at an insulin resistant state, and the likelihood of these foods affecting me more than my neighbor is pretty high. And so I started to really just dive in and look at what foods are most damaging and what foods have higher rates of like higher glycemic indexes and stuff like that, and how my blood sugar was getting thrown off. And so I started to do simple things to fix that. So like immediately I got rid of sugar and flour. I quickly understood that this was basically the worst two things that you can consume when it comes to blood sugar dysregulation and insulin resistance. So anything with added sugars and like processed refined flours had to go. So that includes, breads, desserts, cakes, pastas, that type of stuff was just not going to fit in my lifestyle because it was really damaging. And one thing to note as well, and a lot of people don't realize this, women with PCOS are very, very prone to binging. And a lot of that comes from the blood sugar dysregulation. And I would have said, if I looked back then, I did not have a lot of control over food. So like when I would get set off, I would get set off. So I could, easily finish a half a box of cereal or easily consume a pint of ice cream. And I didn't understand that that was binge-like behavior. But immediately when I got rid of sugar and flour, I noticed I was just more stable. My moods were more stable. My sleep was getting better. And I didn't have that same tendency and propensity to binging. And so that was one of the first things I realized. And then, of course, I just started with like your simple blood sugar tips. So I started consuming protein first and making sure protein was a priority at all of my meals and making sure I was getting a decent amount of protein and good sources, of course, chicken, fish, beef, eggs, etc. And making sure that was kind of like the king of the meal. And that really helped me manage as well. I started focusing heavily on non-starchy vegetables, your leafy greens, tomatoes, celery, bell pepper, that kind of thing, for the fiber and the additional vitamins and minerals. And of course, with the elimination of that sugar and flour, my blood sugars stabilized very, very quickly. And then lastly, I really switched up the way that I was working out. A lot of people with PCOS don't realize that too, but you're a little bit more prone to cortisol issues. You're a lot more prone to stress on the body. And I was actually arguably overdoing exercise at the time. I was so desperate to follow that calories in, calories out model. I thought that I wasn't doing enough. And so I was doing HIIT workouts and running. And ultimately, I think that was causing more stress on my body and more dysregulation. So I kind of toned it back a little bit and just focused heavily on resistance training and some lighter cardio exercises like walking and light swimming, things like that that weren't going to put me into that stressed state of over exercising and basically under eating. And so that's essentially kind of the foundational steps. I also included a couple supplements too. Of course, berberine one of my favorites, and inositol, and that really became a staple of my protocol as well as those supplements alongside bees and some other things that I added in just to help. And so that was essentially what I did. And the beautiful thing was that as I saw results very quickly, as do most women with PCOS, because we know when we start treating the root cause, things shift quick. And so it was very motivating for me to see results that fast.
Yeah, that inositol, I know, when my daughter was diagnosed with PCOS a little over a year ago, you were the first one I contacted. I'm like, oh, what do we do? Like, I know what to do, but what are some things that we might be missing? And you told me about the inositol. And we just had Cynthia Thurlow on a few weeks ago talking about her new inositol brand. So yeah, that can be game changing for a lot of women. So I know you did some intermittent fasting, and I think we all need to be careful not to overdo that. But did you do any sort of schedule that worked well and again, this is very individualized, but sometimes people or women with PCOS, their cortisol can also be pretty wonky. And I see that over and over. And sometimes overdoing, just like you said, like overdoing the exercise was probably, throwing those cortisol levels off too. But what kind of intermittent fasting did you do? Again, this works for you and your schedule. And then do you still practice that, or have you been able to back off of that?
Yeah, great question. So I kind of was doing the evening fasting before evening fasting became cool. So I've always been a breakfast person. It's always been something that I wake up hungry, and I like to set my day off with something in my stomach. And so when I decided to incorporate intermittent fasting, I actually kind of went wayward. At the time, this was, 4 or 5 years, no, longer than that, 5 to 7 years ago. And intermittent fasting in the morning, skipping breakfast was the thing. And I just thought, that's not really for me. I like to eat. I was had so much blood sugar dysregulation too. I don't think I would have made it to lunch without doing it. And so anyway, I ended up doing the evening fasting during PCOS, and I wouldn't do it daily. I would do it probably 2 to 4 times a week. And I would just pull dinner up really early, have my last meal at 2 to 3, and then go the next day until that breakfast. And that really, really worked for me. And, now we're seeing a lot of the metabolic benefits coming from that evening fasting, but that's essentially what I did. And that worked best for me. I also noticed that helped quite a bit with sleep. And again, I didn't do this every day because it was, it's a little bit socially awkward to skip dinner. And I've always prioritized like eating with my family and sitting with my kids. And so I would, still do the routine of dinner. I just would not necessarily have a very large dinner. And that worked great for me. And I still practice evening fasting to some degree. My family in general tries to eat earlier than probably your average. We try to really aim for 4 to 4:30 if we can. Now, it's not always perfect, but we do eat dinner early, especially on the weekends. And so when I'm just not hungry, I just don't eat dinner, and it just works great for me. And I just find that it fits naturally with me that way.
Yeah, that little nuance can be game changing for people. And I'm like you, like I'm usually hungry in the morning, not really hungry right when I get up, but that like mid morning where I used to be, when I first started intermittent fasting too, I'm like, oh, I can't eat till lunch. But I'm a morning person, like I'm up between 5 and 6 most days. So for somebody who sleeps till 9 or 10, that's 3 or 4 hours, a difference. So they're, maybe they're waiting till noon or 1, but they've only been up for a couple of hours, where it's like, if you've been up since 5, it does make sense, especially if you're working out, to have more of your food earlier in the day. So I've started to do, and I naturally did this also. Like I've never been a person who likes to eat late at night. I
Yeah.
don't like to eat, right before I go to bed. I don't like to go to bed with a full stomach. I know some people, I've worked with people who are like, I can't go to bed hungry, where, I'm kind of the opposite. But I think that little tweak and that little nuance can work so well for not only women with PCOS, but other people because usually there's cortisol issues going on there too. A lot of times the thyroid issues are going hand in hand. So just flipping it and fasting through dinner, if you're listening and you haven't tried that yet, I think that can be, just a game-changing approach. So I'm going to switch gears to a topic where I'm sure you get so many questions. It's just probably the most controversial topic going on. I just had a guest on a few weeks ago talking about this as well. I'm sure you get daily questions from those who you're working with, you're following, but what are your thoughts on semaglutide, however you want to say it, Wegovy, Ozempic, tirzepatide, all of it? Like what are your overall thoughts? And I think it's hard. I know for me, it's hard for me when people just ask my general thoughts. It's like,
Yeah.
well, I don't know your background. I don't know your history. I don't know your lifestyle. I don't know what you're struggling with. I don't know your disease processes. So all of those things come into play. Like, I don't know if you're just somebody who, you know, eats total crap all day and has, a ton of sugar, and you really just need to focus on exercise, or if you're somebody who's had thyroid issues for 20 years and do all of the things, and maybe, your metabolism is kind of broken, if that's what you want to say. But yeah, give us your overall
Yeah.
opinion on those. And if somebody just, it's one of those questions, I'm sure that, it's like when somebody asks me, it's like you kind of dread the question because it's so vague.
You're
So
like,
put it into context for us and what your thoughts
yeah.
are.
Yeah, I like this question because I think we're going to be forced to talk about it because it's not going to go away. But I will say that there are a lot of people that are very, very passionate on both sides of this.
Mhm.
And I try to run the radical middle, if that makes sense. So I try to do exactly what you do and analyze the whole situation and then give my advice from that point of view. Yeah, like you said, this is a very controversial topic, and I'll say this: I think that one, I'm open to I'll say this out front. I'm open to the medications. I think that they can be helpful in a lot of situations in terms of helping people understand their appetite or understand like overeating and all that kinds of stuff. I will say though, I proceed with heavy, heavy, heavy amounts of caution. And this is exactly what I tell people. A lot of people are asking me, like, what would you do? Would you go on them? And this goes for anything. Anytime there's a quote unquote miracle weight loss drug or miracle this and it's doing all this, it's going to cure obesity, it sets off a lot of red flags for me because I do not believe that there will ever be a medication that can overcome bad diet and lifestyle. Now, with that being said as well, I do totally understand that this has helped some people get, the last 20 pounds off and all this other things. But I will say the vast majority of people that I talk to on the semaglutides is they don't understand that there is a massive weight regain effect, massive. And the phase 2 trial of the initial study with semaglutides showed this. It's not a secret. It's just not being told. And I think that's mostly because there's quite a bit of profit in this medication. And a lot of people aren't seeing that as well. I've seen a lot of people get coupons for the medication for the first couple months and they're getting it for free. Then all of a sudden the drug manufacturers are like, no more coupons. Now you got to pay $1,300 for this. So I've seen a lot of shady practices around the medications. I had a client that was getting the semaglutides from a yoga studio, which is quite horrifying to me in a lot of ways. So I think that there's a lot of things that you need to proceed with caution on when it comes to these, and also understand that it's not magic and that it's going to really, really shut down your appetite. You're probably going to feel quite sick. But that will, one, your body will eventually get used to that to some degree. Two, you are going to get off of the medications. For most people are not going to be on this for the rest of their life. And that appetite and those same food behaviors will return if they haven't been treated appropriately. And so I have quite a few red flags with them, but I also think that in some individuals' cases, they could be helpful. But I do not think that the way that these medications are being marketed and the way that even doctors are in these weight loss clinics are selling them, I do not necessarily think that it's being the full story is being told to clients. I don't think that they're being told that there's a pretty big weight gain or re-weight gain effect. Nobody's being told about the potential lean muscle mass loss, the bone density issues. There's a lot of things that we just don't know taking these from the long term or for the long term, the thyroid, T-cell cancer, that kind of stuff. A lot of people are just completely oblivious. So I think that if the patient is well educated, well informed, understands that they must do lifestyle and diet changes if they want to keep the weight off, I think that they can be a positive. Unfortunately, most that I'm seeing on these are not having those more difficult conversations with their doctor endocrinologist.
Right. I have the same thoughts. Like you need to do a program along with this if you
Yeah.
haven't learned about blood sugar regulation and insulin sensitivity, because it's helping your insulin sensitivity. But once, if you don't do the proper lifestyle management, that insulin sensitivity is going to fail you again if you're not changing your lifestyle. So, sometimes I have people say, okay, what are your thoughts? Should I do your program or should I do this? It's like, again, I'm not sure. But if you are, because I don't know your whole history, but if you are going to choose semaglutide, I would encourage you to do my program along with it. So you learn all the tools, you learn everything that you need to know to regulate things if you do come off. And like you said, it's usually a matter of when you're coming off, not if you're coming off, because one, we don't know, I know some of them have been around for 20 years, but these newer ones with different indications, different dosages, they haven't only been a couple of years. And so number one, your insurance company is not going to want to pay $1,200 to $1,500 a month for these lifelong. Or number two, you hit your goal and then what? Like, again, your insurance company might cover it for a while because you're very ill. You have all of these comorbidities, but then once you turn that around, they're not going to want to keep footing the bill for that. And I did have an expert on a couple of weeks ago where I wasn't aware that they can compound semaglutide. So that was interesting to me. And, there might be something there. The cost is a lot lower and then the dosage, but at the same time, anything that's kind of just messing with your physiology for that long of a time, you just have to say, like, this is going to come back to bite us. We thought fen and phentermine, like all of those things were the magic pill. And again, I'm not completely against this either. I just think people are hopping on board and, saying, yeah, inject me before they're really educated well and really have thought through the long term, kind of like, kind of just even comparing it to bariatric surgery. It's like, it seems more great. Like, this is going to save my life. This is the answer. But I can't tell you how many people I have met who
every bit back.
20 years later, they're right back at the same weight.
Now missing
before.
Yeah.
And now malnourished because of their anatomy has been rearranged and completely, thrown off. So yeah, it remains to be seen. I hope you and I can go back and eat our words and say, no, this was great. But like you said, the muscle mass loss is a huge concern to me. At the very least, do some like a DEXA scan or some sort of tracking to make sure that it's not, all muscle mass loss. But yeah, you don't want to be frail in your old age. And that just sets you up for a whole nother, a comorbidity in and of itself that you don't want to live with.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that people's guards just need to, as with anything, right? Like, not just even the obesity, weight loss, diabetes medications that come out, but anytime there's this massive promise from pharmaceutical companies, I'm totally for conventional medicine and use of pharmaceuticals, absolutely 100%. But you also just have to look a little bit behind the scenes and see, okay, well, that's a promise, but somebody's making a profit, right? And so I just always caution people, like, it's a risk reward. And I just want people to be fully informed when they decide to make the decision. And I've had several of my clients that are using semaglutides and then working in my program at the same time. And I am very proud of their progress. And I'll even have some come off the semaglutides while they're still working with me so that we can really heavily focus on maintenance. And I think that that's a great approach, is find something that is going to help you stay on track and on board and understand the physiology behind all of it, because it is important, like you said, to understand how they work, what's going to happen when you get off of them, and just to make sure that it doesn't go to waste if you do end up losing a lot of weight, because it's I just hate to see the weight regain and some of the consequences of these meds. So yeah, like you said, I hope we eat our words, and I hope there is eventually a miracle drug of some sort that's really going to help people. But I also don't want to see people suffer in any way, or have negative financial consequences, or alter their hormones in any way that doesn't benefit them in the long term.
Yeah. And I see a win-win being, doing a program, learning how to be more insulin sensitive, turning your insulin resistance around and the base root cause while you're doing it. And then hopefully being able to wean off little by little so you don't get the weight regain. So I'm sure people are wondering, like, you're the ketogenic nutritionist, and of course we don't always have to be ketogenic. I'm sure people are wondering, like, oh, does Temple, is she in ketosis all the time?
Yeah.
But how do you go about, like, if somebody wants to work with you, or, how do you like, how are your programs set up? Like, are they, I'm sure people are wondering, like, do I have to go ketogenic, and do I have to do it right away? Do you kind of ease them into it? Or how do you go about getting somebody into ketosis? And I guess we should probably just really just give a broad overview of why you would even do that. Like, why do people want to be in ketosis? And, how are you starting them down that process?
Yeah, so I have a very individualistic approach for everyone in terms of their insulin sensitivity. And for people that may be listening that are like, what is she talking about? Everybody tolerates carbohydrates a little bit different than the other. Now, there's ways to improve this. There's ways to strategically use this for weight loss and or blood glucose maintenance, etc. But with that being said, a 6'5" extremely athletic male may not need to be in strict ketosis all the time. Whereas somebody that's, A1Cs 8, 9, 10, they're pushing, needing insulin, they may want to be in ketosis for the vast majority of time to get themselves back to a better place where they can handle carbohydrates and handle food correctly. And so there's a very broad spectrum there. And that's really the main point that I focus on with my clients is like, keto is a tool in your toolbox to use and to whip out whenever you need it, and understand why it would be used, when it should be used, the benefits of that. And so some examples of when I have people in ketosis are going to be obviously, women with PCOS that are trying to conceive. We need to get their insulin levels low. We need to make sure testosterone and estrogen are doing the things that they need to do for ovulation and all of that. And so type 2 diabetes is another really good example. Obesity is another really good example. But I always try to get people to understand their labs as well, get fasting insulin pulled, maybe even a C-peptide, understand what their levels of inflammation are. And so that way they can do that risk reward analysis of, okay, yes, keto is a bit restrictive in terms of taking away the carbohydrates, but it's going to vastly improve my metabolic panel. And so that's what I do with my clients is we look at labs, we look at certain things that would indicate that they need to be a little bit more restrictive on carbohydrates. And then we come up with a protocol on how to do that and also how to sustain it. One thing that we need to obviously take into consideration is, are they going to be able to restrict carbs this much for that long? And what does their lifestyle look like? And obviously taking it into consideration, are they appropriate for keto long term, and what their life looks like? Are they just going to be able to maintain it is my biggest concern. And then typically what I do with my clients is once we get them to more of a maintenance stage, their labs are checking out, they're much more insulin sensitive, I switch to more of a lower carb style diet where you're not going back to the standard American junk food, eating tons of processed carbohydrates. We're still sticking to whole food because naturally eating a whole food diet is lower carb, right? And so that's typically what we end up on is some sort of maintenance style with a low carb diet. And obviously if their disease processes align with that and their labs align with that, that's what I really stick to.
Yeah. And I do a lot of the same. It's like, if you have those really broken metabolisms along the lines of type 2 diabetes, needing insulin, severe fatty liver or cirrhosis because your fatty liver has accelerated, you have PCOS, like, yeah, we need to pull back on carbohydrates because you're just not tolerating those. So that's where that, 25 to 50 range might come in, 50 being on the higher side. Whereas, a couple years into the process, now you're more metabolically sensitive. You can handle those carbohydrates. I should say metabolically flexible, insulin sensitive. You can maybe afford to bump it up to 75, see how you do there, then go up to 100. So I always say the same thing. Like, this is not forever, but right now you are metabolically broken. Like, you can't
Things are
metabolize
well.
fat well, like, you're not. So we have to kind of force your body into it for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think that makes the thought process a lot easier for people once they understand, oh, okay, like keto doesn't have to be this ultra restrictive thing that I do for the rest of my life, which unfortunately a lot of people, dietitians, a lot of them portray it as like this ultra restrictive diet that's never going to be sustainable long term. All this stuff, it's got this bad connotation online, when in reality it's just a tool. It's just a tool that has extremely high efficacy when it comes to insulin sensitizing, blood sugar management, reversing disease processes like the ones you mentioned. And once you can understand, okay, this is a tool in my tool chest, I think people just do a lot better in terms of their mental status around it, etc.
Yeah. And I can't reiterate enough. Like, if you go back to what you were doing to get ill, that 300 to 400 grams of carbohydrate, you will get ill again, especially if you're genetically predisposed to do so. So yeah, I mean, once you are, a lot of times people can be around that 100-gram mark, somewhere around there. Once they're metabolically sensitive, flexible, and insulin sensitive like that, I think that's a good marker to shoot for most people. But yeah, you start going 200, 300, 400. There's a subset of people who can manage that amount of carbohydrate if they're very, very active, or, maybe an athlete, like a professional athlete. Even then I'm kind of like, no, you should really train your body to use both fuels. But yeah, you go back to what you're doing before you're going to get ill. So, because I do get that question, like, well, how long do I follow low carb? It's like, you just, if you want to stay well, this is what you do. So I do have a question about, so what if somebody's been doing keto and, maybe went off of it for a while, try to come back to it. And I see this in my world, and now it's just not working the same way. Like, what do you say to those people? Cause I get a lot of those questions too. Like, keto works so well, but now it's not. Like what's happening there?
Yeah, I look at a lot of different, there's a lot of things that can be happening. There's a lot. First of all, we definitely want to look at labs, see if there's any chronic systemic inflammation happening. I definitely look at lifestyle stuff, like are you sleeping? Are you super stressed out? What's going on with cortisol? Are we good there? If the individual is in like perimenopause or menopause, I definitely want to look at like a reproductive, testosterone, estrogen dominance, those types of things, low testosterone, those types of things can all play into what's going on. And then also I have people really look and track and their food and see, okay, am I really in ketosis, or am I just, maybe trying to follow this and I'm not necessarily going as low as I need to, or whatever. I'll have people track. Another thing I see too that can occasionally happen is people tend to think that there's no caloric matter in keto, and then what I'll see happen is they'll switch to keto, but what will end up happening is they'll lower carbohydrates, but they'll vastly increase a lot of fat. And I'll see people consuming and over consuming fat, and the emphasis still won't be on protein. And yes, they've lowered their carbohydrates, which is fantastic and will help with insulin sensitivity. But if you're adding, 700 additional calories, 800 additional calories of nuts and cheeses and heavy whipping cream and all this other stuff, you're not going to see weight loss. And I'm not, and I need to say this because I feel the need to, but I'm not a calories in, calories out person. Like, I do not think you should restrict your calories significantly for long periods of time. It's just not going to work with your metabolic rate and things like that. Hormonally, it's not great. But you also can't excessively consume calories and expect to lose weight. And so that's kind of one of the things I'll check out too, is if sometimes there can be a little bit of a disconnect of like, yeah, I'm going low carb, I'm not eating sugar, but then they inadvertently add significant amounts of butter and they're drinking coconut oil in their coffee and doing all these things that adds up over time. But firstly, I definitely want to look at hormones, hormonal panels, where they are in life. Are they sleeping? Is something going on with cortisol, low testosterone, estrogen dominance, all the kind of things that can cause obesity indirectly.
Yeah. And I think sometimes people just have this assumption, if they're following a ketogenic diet, it's all the fat. Like, there's just fat, and fat, because we're taking away the carbohydrate for fueling. We're trying to convert the body over to fat metabolism, but there's different way, keto is just a state of fat burning over carbohydrate burning. And I think people think keto is a diet, like it has to be this high fat diet. And I know that you, as a ketogenic nutritionist, you will have more of a focus on a higher protein, where not everybody does. When they're following keto, they're doing all this fat and they're still kind of lacking protein, where your emphasis is more on hitting protein targets, still
Yeah.
forcing the body into fat burning, but doing it in a higher protein manner.
Yeah, and I found that that just tends to work better. Now, if I was counseling someone that needed therapeutic ketones in their blood levels for, let's say, you know, schizophrenia, some of these mental health issues, lots of the neurological stuff, that absolutely people need higher levels of ketone in the blood. A common kind of thought is that, oh, if I eat too much protein, it's going to turn into sugar and then I'm never going to get into ketosis. And that's just not the case. It's very difficult to overconsume the excessive amounts of protein needed to kick yourself out of ketosis. Now, most of my clients are not necessarily getting into these extremely deep states of ketosis. Like, I'm not seeing people in the 3s or the higher 2s when I'm talking about ketone levels in the blood, but that doesn't necessarily indicate you're going to lose more weight, right? And so a common thought about protein is, oh, it's going to turn to sugar and I'm never going to get into ketosis. That's just not the case. My clients are in ketosis. They're just in a little bit lower levels of ketosis, which is completely fine. You still see as much weight loss results, etc. Unless an individual needs to be in significantly high state of ketosis, we don't necessarily need to lower protein, etc. Again, now that's those individuals are very specific cases. Cancer treatment, you know, schizophrenia, like I've already mentioned, and your neurological diseases. But most people that are seeking weight loss and comorbidity improvement don't necessarily need to see these super deep states of ketosis. And so having that emphasis on protein is just so helpful in appetite control, controlling cravings, keeping you full, blood sugar management, all of it, that I don't ever want to skimp on the protein, because it's one of the, I would argue it's probably the most important macronutrient that we consume.
Yeah. And there's definitely different ways to approach the ketogenic diet. So to work with an expert like yourself is really important. So I have a couple of questions from my Instagram community, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, let's do it.
And of course, they're always, you know, the ones that I'm getting on a regular basis. So I try to pull the ones that I'm like, yep, this is something that so many people ask about. But the first one being, how do I get enough fiber on keto? People are so worried about that fiber intake. And, you know, it just goes along with eating the healthy whole grains and fruits and vegetables mantra that we've been so indoctrinated with, that people just are really afraid that they start a ketogenic diet, they're not going to eat any fiber, they're not going to poop. What do you say to that?
I would say, first of all, understand that you can get all the fiber that you need to get from non-starchy vegetables. All of the non-starchy veggies that you're going to consume in a ketogenic diet, you're going to get plenty of fiber from that. I am far more worried about inflammation and insulin resistance causing cancer than I am lack of fiber, by a long shot. And you look at statistics, you're at much higher risk for those types of conditions. And I would even say the research and the studies on fiber is controversial in itself. And so understand that that's not like the recommendations that we've come up for fiber are, I don't want to say questionable, but they could be argued. We'll say it that way. And so you can get plenty of fiber and all that you need from lower carb vegetables. I will say this, a common mistake I see people make on keto that causes issues GI wise is just the overconsumption of dairy. Honestly, it turns into this ketogenic cheese fest, and we're eating significantly high amounts of cheese and dairy. And I'm not saying dairy's bad. I'm just saying oftentimes I'll see people, and once they go keto, the lack of emphasis on vegetables is there, and they tend to make up a lot of those calories with cheese, heavy cream, and fat. And we know that that doesn't necessarily help us go to the bathroom. And so I'd say, make sure you're not over consuming dairy. Make sure you're eating a lot of non-starchy vegetables. Avocados are extremely high in fiber. So focusing on those things. And like I said, just not over consuming the cheese and the fat, you're going to be just fine bowel movements wise. And in terms of fiber, you'll be totally fine there.
Yeah. And I always tell people, if they're starting intermittent fasting with this, like, you're not eating as often, you're not eating as much, so you're not going to poop as much. Like, that's just normal. Your body is utilizing those all, what you're eating a whole lot better. So that is a good thing. It's actually, you're not eating so often. So you're actually absorbing and utilizing and evacuating appropriately. And, to poop 3 to 5 times a day maybe isn't what is intended for your personal body. And when you pull back on that, but I know for me, like fiber, I love, non-starchy vegetables, but it's more so like just the bulk of the food and the eating experience for me, I think.
Yeah.
And just, I love salads. I love the flavor of them. I love the crunch of them, but they take a long time to eat too. So I think that can be an important thing for a lot of people. Not only just, we tend to focus on oh, you have to have fiber to poop, but it's like just the eating experience, because you do, when you start a low carb ketogenic approach, you can maybe feel a little bit like, oh, I got to pull away from a lot of foods, where this just makes the experience that much better.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Question number 2. I get this all the time too. What are some low carb options for vegetarian or plant-based?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I would recommend, so I typically recommend the book Ketotarian by Dr. Will Cole for anyone that's trying to follow keto, plant-based or vegetarian. Obviously, I would say that you can do it. It's absolutely possible. Do I think it's optimal? Probably not. Just in terms of getting the right amino acid makeup and all of that is very, very challenging. You're already limited because of the amounts of carbs that you've removed. And so it really takes away a lot of the more common protein vegetarian options like beans, etc. And so, I would just say obviously non-starchy vegetables, nuts and seeds like chia, flax, pecans, walnuts, macadamia nuts can all be good. And then, the protein sources, they might have to come in forms of some supplementation. And because that's really it, right? Those are, olives, avocados, but those don't have protein in them. It's mostly fat and fiber. And so, yeah, I think it can be a challenge for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like if people add dairy or eggs, it's a whole different ball game. But if you're like vegan, then it's very challenging. And driving hunger too, just because it's really hard to be low carb and higher protein if you're not including eggs or dairy. I did have a guest on several months ago. I know her first name is Veswana, and she wrote The Vegetarian Reset, and that's a cookbook full of vegetarian based low carb, because she developed pre-diabetes. She was Indian. She had never eaten meat in her entire life. So she developed a cookbook that does a really phenomenal job. And that's another resource that I always recommend. But she does add dairy and she does add some cheese. So that makes it a little bit easier. All right.
Sure.
Last question from my Instagram community, and then we'll talk about all the ways that we can find you and learn more about you. How do you do a ketogenic approach if you have a family?
Oh yeah. And I love this question because I do this. And one, understand that it's all about how you approach food and how you talk about food around your kids, especially if you have little ones. And so understanding that like your words matter, and not to talk about food in a, oh, this is bad or this is good and that kind of way. What I recommend people do is just do a full like pantry, refrigerator, all that clean out. A lot of times what I see people try to do is they're like, oh, well, my kids are in the house, therefore all of this junk is in the house. Well, my question to you is, are you okay? And are you okay with feeding your kids junk? Because they're going to develop some of the same issues that you may be focusing with. Now, I'm not saying you should be ultra restrictive with kids, because I don't think you should. What I would encourage people to do is find alternatives. If you're going to have cookies, make them keto friendly and have a chocolate chip cookie. If you're going to have whatever else, buy it a keto alternative, a low carb alternative. Because it's going to be very hard to change your lifestyle if your entire family is following a completely different lifestyle. So I think that involves some conversations. Like if you're living with spouse or whatever, I think you have that conversation. Like, I'm really trying to change this for our family. They're going to be better off long term. I don't think you need to be restrictive with it, but add in foods that are helpful and take away the foods that cause problems. Ultimately, it's going to be very challenging for you to stay on track if there's pints of ice cream in the freezer and soda everywhere and all these other really barriers to your success. And then lastly, what I say do is if you make every meal's focus protein, then you can kind of add and take away whatever you need. So like for instance, and my kids, they eat a decent amount of starchy vegetables and fruit. So they'll eat sweet potatoes and they'll have fruit and stuff like that. And what I'll do is I just make sure every meal has protein and a non-starchy vegetable, and then we can add whatever the kids decide that they want. If I need to, air fry some sweet potato fries or whatever for them because that's what they want, then I'll do that, and I'll just have the steak and broccoli, and then they can have steak and broccoli and sweet potato fries. So as long as you make the majority of the meal keto, low carb friendly, then you can kind of add things in that are either already prepared or something a little bit more simple. But you cannot live your life making two separate meals if you've got a family. And understand that the way that you eat, your kids are going to watch. And especially with littles and even older teenage kids in college, they're watching. And so I think understanding that you're the most powerful influence in their life when it comes to health and nutrition, and embrace it and just do the best you can, obviously without using those kind of language and words that can cause a little bit of guilt or negative associations with food.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. It's hard. It's a fine line. It's a fine line as a very nutritionally educated mom to like not go crazy, but still, for them to understand what food's doing in their body. So yeah, setting the environment up to be successful is, I think, the most important thing. But yeah, like you want to be crazy. It's like, oh, well, I can have a bag of siete corn, well, not corn chip, but chips, alternative chips. But what, like you said, you don't want all of those things that could sabotage you to be available either. And I think, I think you're at a slight advantage if you're adapting this lifestyle when your kids are younger versus grade school to middle school, high school. It's like, then they're like, I'm not really liking this. But we've always been healthy eaters in my household too. I have my daughter's in college, but I have 2 teenage boys who eat a lot. They're athletic. They're burning a ton of calories, and they understand the protein is the basis of our meals in our home, at least. But same thing, that's exactly what I do. Like if we have, a taco night and I'm eating a taco salad, they're eating the same things. I'm just going to make rice for them, and they can have the rice along with it. Or we'll have some kind of meat and vegetable and a potato. I might have a half a potato. They might have 1.5 potatoes. Like it's different. And I've been trying to do that more on my Instagram stories. Like, don't make 2 meals. Just make a few minor changes or add a few things in that maybe you're avoiding just to get more metabolically healthy. But I think it all comes down to like just having plenty of whole foods, setting the environment up to be successful, and teaching kids too. Like I can't tell you how many parents I meet where they're like, oh, so-and-so, my middle one or my youngest one is just a snacker, like just grazes all day long. It's like, well, that's because you've let him or her graze all. And I totally get why kids get into that. Cause it's like they snack, they don't get full, they snack, they don't full. But I think that's one of the biggest things to start with young kids too, is just getting back to meals and not snacking, which is really, really challenging when you go to school and there's snack time and
it's all
snack. It's like they're eating. I've worked in the schools. I see it. They're eating all day long, drinking sugary drinks all day long. Even if they're told not to bring them, they still have them in their water bottles or whatever. So, so those are some really excellent tips. So, well, let's wrap things up. Where can we find more of you if people want to work with you? You have a huge following on Instagram. So, I know you post there very, very regularly. So, tell us where to find you.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at the.ketogenic.nutritionist. I'm on TikTok, the same handle, the.ketogenic.nutritionist. I'm on Twitter too, which is like kind of a new thing for me, but I'm at Temple Dietitian there. But however you guys want to get in touch with me, shoot me a Instagram message, whatever. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions and talk through things. So that's kind of what I'm on.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time today. Education. We might just have to have you back for a third time at some point because you're just so knowledgeable. And I love, I just love how you just tell your message straight. Like you're not trying to dance around topics, and, put things in a way where people aren't understanding. It's like, nope, this is how things work. This is, this is what we do, if you want to heal. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate you being in the nutrition world and keep doing. Oh, we should mention, I don't know. Have you told your followers that you're in, yeah, they know that you're in school to be a functional.
I'm in school to be a naturopathic doctor, which is really fun. And I'm learning like so much about, environmental medicine and plastics and the role of stress on the weight. So yeah, it's been very eye-opening for me. I've known that these things matter, but sitting down and really looking at the lab implications and all the different testing methods that you can do to figure out root causes that naturopathic doctors do is really just amazing. And I think the demand for naturopaths is just going to keep exploding because it already is. And so, yeah, I'm excited about it. But yeah, I would love to get back on it whenever we have some time. And it's always an honor to be on your podcast and get to talk through this, especially with a fellow dietitian who kind of gets the background and all of it.
Yeah, we'll bring you back as you learn those topics in school, bring you back on some of the things that maybe we haven't hit hard. So thanks again for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you.